Welcome everyone to this new tutorial. In this tutorial, you are of course gonna learn what you can see right now on screen. But I also want to emphasize that I am not only gonna teach you how to create this scene and all that stuff, I actually want to show you some techniques on how I make my looping animations more and more interesting. So when you have a looping animation, it often becomes boring after a few redos, right? It just plays and then loops it and loops it and loops it. And to kind of disrupt this whole loop the whole time, I like to use a program like Premiere Pro just to change maybe colors, right? I can also speed up or slow down the animation, but changing the colors already does a lot to our scene itself, as you can see right here. So let's look at our final scene inside Blender to see what we're actually going to create. You can see that it's quite simple. We have an environment which is just cylinders with an array modifier. In here we have our little animation going, as you can see right here. And in the background we have a cube, which could be also a plane. I just did a cube, but it's just the background color. And I also created these cubes here. And I would like to go a little bit more into depth about this when we're gonna create it, but this creates more interesting lighting, okay? Because there's a point light back here, and it just creates more interesting lighting, but we'll go into that a little bit later on in this video. So if you're excited about this, then let's jump into a new Blender file. I'm using Blender 3.00, and we can start to create everything. The first thing that we're gonna do is just delete this default cube because we hate it. Then we can use a cylinder, and I like to do the cap fill at nothing because we don't need these caps. Now, add a modifier, solidify, and we're gonna make it a little bit thicker, right? Let's do minus 0.15, something like that. Apply it. Let's rotate the cylinder because when I'm clicking on 1, which is the front view, I kind of want to look inside, right? So rotate X 90. Then we want to make this a bit more clean because it just looks very blocky. So let's use a Bevel Modifier, make this amount a little bit smaller, and then of course a few more segments. Let's add a subdivision surface and right click to Shade Smooth. So you guys probably already know we're going to use an array modifier, and I'm gonna hide my bevel and subdivision so we can focus on this particular modifier alone. This modifier is great for duplicating or arraying a certain model. You guys, of course, already know how this works. But if I want to do it around the y-axis instead of the x-axis, you can see that a little problem arises. The first thing that happens here is it actually goes towards the z-axis, right? Why is that? That is because we added this model, right? We added a cylinder, created a solidify modifier, and then rotated it around the x-axis. The problem is, it has still the old axis, the old rotation into mind. So we have to select our model, Ctrl A, and apply the new rotation. Now, we have the y-axis, but it is not scaling up, right? So how do we do this? Actually, we are not in need of a relative offset. We will use the object offset. So now we can create a model, Shift A, empty, plane axis, select our cylinder again, and then object, we're gonna select this empty. Now this empty is selected and you think like, nothing changed, but I highly suggest you just scale this a bit up, right? So go to the front view 1 and scale this up. We can also move this around, and you can see that we create this cool little binocular that we also had in our final scene before, right? Here. So the count actually matters for two things. First of all, how big you want this to go, right? So how many of these circles you want, but it will also kind of count later on with the lighting. But I highly suggest you just do a count of 10 or 12 and then move it a bit backwards, this, like this here, and that should be totally fine. Go into the front view with 1, then select your camera, go to View, Align View, and align active camera to view. So now the camera kind of snaps towards your view. The problem is it just doesn't really work the way that I expect it to work, and there's probably an explanation for it. But if you look here in item, you can see that we are quite close here. So the X location should be at 0, the Z location at 0, and of course the rotation of the X axis should be at 90. Now with the Y location, we can just zoom in or out, right? So you can choose how big you want your scene to look. And of course, you can still move this empty around to your desires. Now we are ready to create our animation. So for our animation, we do need a little sphere. So mesh, UV sphere. Scale this a bit down, right click and shade smooth. Now we want the sphere to follow a path. And we first need to create a path, right? So Shift A, curve, and then circle. This circle we're going to rotate around the x-axis for 90 degrees and scale it a bit down. Then select the sphere, go into the Object Constraint properties, add Object Constraint, and then use Follow Path. We're going to select this newly created Bezier circle, and in the front view, you can just see if it actually touches here. But if it kind of goes through or is way too small and does not touch this inner little cylinder, then you can just scale up or down your Bezier circle. Okay, so somewhere around here seems to work fine. Now, how do we animate this? This is actually very, very simple. The first thing that I want you to think about is just how many frames you want this animation to take. I'm gonna do a fairly short one. In my official render, I actually did 120 frames, but I think with 60 you should also be fine. Now, when we select this sphere, you can see that we have an offset here. When you change this offset, you can see that our sphere moves around our path or circle in this case. So we can animate this. Let's put it at 0, and I personally like to start my animation at frame 0 for right now. Right click, insert keyframe at offset 0. Go to your last keyframe, in this case this is 60, and you can see that an offset of 100 will create a whole circle around until it meets the end again, right? So here, 100 will be our new keyframe. Right click, insert keyframe. And from frame 0 to frame 60, we have a whole rotation. I actually use frame 0, but start to render from frame 1. And this is because if frame 0 and 60 are exactly the same, you 2 times render the same image essentially. And this is not only unnecessary because you render 2 times, but it also creates a little stutter in your animation, and you'd want to avoid that. So that is why I do it like this. There are other ways to do it as well. You can just render a whole scene and then, remove 1 frame, also totally fine, but this is just in my workflow right now. What we can also see is, if we play this, you can see that it is quite slow in the beginning, then speeds up and starts to slow down again. I actually don't want that. So I'll make sure both of these keyframes are selected with A, then click on T and do linear. So now my interpolation is linear and it will just, smoothly keep rotating. That is our whole animation and our environment. I suggest you save this and then we can go on to our material section and lighting. So the first thing that I want to do is go to shading here and just go into cycles instead of Eevee. Go to the render viewport shading, and here we can see our materials. In this case, I want my materials to actually be very, very simple. And I'm just going to keep everything in black and white, so anywhere in the grayscale essentially. And then I'm going to put colors on later in the compositor. You don't have to do this, you can already create colors, and that's totally up to you, but in this case, I did it like this. Let's create a new material. I'm gonna put the sheen all the way up and put the roughness at 0.8, and that is essentially the whole material. We're gonna use the same material for the cylinders. So material 001, we can just do a white material environment. And they are a bit hard to judge. Like you can see it here on the top, which is perfect, but inside here, where our camera view actually will be later on, it is just way too hard to see. So I'm gonna use this world little section here, and I'm gonna play around with the color. Let's also put the device at GPU instead of CPU. That is just a bit quicker. And here we can see our scene. So the background is of course quite bright, right? And it kind of takes away from everything else in the scene. So what I like to do here is just create a plane or a cube, rotate the plane, then scale it up, and this is going to be our new background. And this background we can also give another material. So you can essentially select the same one, duplicate it, and just make the base color darker. This way the background doesn't pop out that much. We don't have to make it transparent, but we can just do it like this, right? And now we can kind of focus upon the lighting that actually is inside of our little animation, binocular, whatever it is. And go back to world to change this if you want to have a brighter light setting or darker. That's totally up to you. One handy thing that I like to use is go into the color management underneath the render properties. Then look into the view transform, which is now set at filmic, but you can go to false color and see some colors here. If the colors are too bright, essentially when we put the strength all the way up, you can see that we are reaching red and even white. This is called overexposure. So you have so much light in there that we will even lose color data. A lot of color data we lose here, essentially. If you have it too dark, which is just all shadows, what happens here is that you get dark blue or even purple colors. And those two things you want to avoid. You want to find a middle ground. And a middle ground seems to be gray. And gray is kind of hard to find. It's between green and orange, kinda. And you can see it back here, but we have gray. I personally, especially when I use just one color inside a scene or I have a very simple scene, I want to over-exaggerate a little bit my lighting, right? So I might put this a little bit higher and reach green, I would say yellow, and sometimes even orange, even though that is a little bit high. But those things I like to use. Now, if we go back to filmic, you can see what this does to our scene. And now we are not underexposed or overexposed. We have a nice exposure and we will keep all our color data, even though we are just using a white color right now. The next thing, we also have a look, which is none at this point. And none essentially is, I think, low contrast or low medium contrast. And Blender itself has a certain contrast look to it, right? So a lot of your renders might look the same contrast-wise. Now, you can do it already in your render. So in your look, you have none in this case, but you can put it to high contrast. And now you can see that we have some more contrast in our scene. It is up to you what you want to use, but I think medium high or medium contrast is way better than what is normally used. And that seems to work quite well for this kind of animation. So this lighting looks decent, but is still quite boring. So I like to add more lights in my scene. So let's put this one here. I am going to grab another 3D viewport and we're gonna grab our light. So this light, point light, if you don't have it, you can just click on Shift A and add a point light. Does or can do a lot to our scene. And one way that I like to add lights is make sure I turn off the other lights in my scene. And now we can see what this light is gonna do. So in the light options here, the object data properties of the light itself, you can change a lot. You can change the power. And you can also change the radius. So the bigger the radius, the more smooth your lighting will be, and the smaller will be very sharp. And let's do it very small for right now, just so you guys can see what's gonna happen with our shadows later on. So this combined with our world already looks better. The world could even go a little bit down, right? So this point light we can put a bit higher and the world light can be a bit lower. And now we have a kind of a nice combination between these two lights. And the animation or this whole scene already looks way more interesting to me. We actually get some shadows which are cool, some extra lighting down here, but on top it's still quite dark. And I personally really like that. But this lighting still looks very boring to me. So let's make sure our background is off again. And I'm going to show you a little technique that you can always use. We can always create some extra shadows. So go into your mesh, you can create a plane, move this plane or rotate it around to the x-axis here. And then we just want to create kind of a elongated plane around the z-axis. And what we can do with this plane is we can array it. Make sure you have a little gap between them, so 1.2 and 1.3, and then put the count higher. So as you can already see, we are creating shadows. Shadows are just as important as lighting, okay? So keep in mind, shadows are cool. We want them. So we can rotate this, scale it maybe a bit down. You can see what this does to our scene, right? So just play around with the scale, the rotation, maybe the array amount. And this will all impact the way that you render your scene here. So if I put it a bit further away, you can see that we get more stripes in this case. Also, if I put my factor around the x-axis a bit further, you can see that this does that. But in this case, you can see that our lighting just looks way more interesting. And this is why I like to use that. What I also told you guys about before is the scale of the lamp, right? The scale of this point light for it now. The scale of this point light actually changes how hard or soft these shadows are gonna be. So the radius right now is quite small, and this makes very sharp shadows. If we put this bigger, you can see that we get a nice and soft fall off. So also kind of up to you what you kind of want to showcase, but that is also quite handy to know. And we of course don't want to see these planes in our render. So select them, go into the object properties, visibility, and then ray visibility camera. Now, it is invisible to the cameras, but of course, the shadows and all of that is still visible in our render. Only the model itself is now invisible. So this already looks quite interesting. Let's hook up our background again, and here we have a quite decent lighting. Awesome! If you render something inside Blender, you can click on F12. You guys probably already know that. Right now in Blender 3.0, the render settings are a bit changed. I have not looked that much into it yet, but right now I don't really feel like rendering too long, let's say. So let's put the time limit at like 10. So now we know that the render will only take 10 seconds. Just a little heads up, this render probably looks a little bit different than you saw before. This is because I recorded in 2 separate days, but I had to turn off my PC quite abruptly because of well, electricity, whatever, but it doesn't matter. We can just continue, but then you know that it looks a little bit different. What you can do once you have rendered your image, you can go into your compositor. Right now you can see that mine here is already purple. This is because I already tried some stuff out, but yours will probably look like this, right? So let's use nodes, and then these nodes will pop up, and then we can actually work with these nodes. The problem is we cannot see our image, so we will use a viewer node here to look at our image. Now, you can do this in 2 ways. You can add a viewer node just like I just did, or you can add a very handy add-on, which I highly suggest you do. So go into Edit, Preferences, and look for the Node Wrangler add-on. Make sure it's turned on, and now when you hold Ctrl and Shift and click on the node, it will put this automatically in the viewer. Now you can showcase your node. So now that we have this viewer in place, we can start to add extra nodes. So what are the nodes that I'm thinking of right now? First of all, I would like to add some contrast. You could do this with a contrast and brightness node here. Just put the contrast higher. Or what I personally like to do is use an RGB curve node. I just like the fact that with these curves, I can control the highlights and shadows a little bit better than with a node as the contrast node. Now, what we also like to do here is add some glare. So the lighting looks cool, but some extra blurriness to the lighting will do a lot to the scene, I think. So let's put this in here. Instead of streaks, let's go to fog glow. And here we can see that there's nothing really happening, and that's because we have to play around with the mix and threshold. So let's put the threshold a little bit lower, and we can see that now these lights actually have some glare around them. So the lower you put them, the more actually will work. And you can see that also now the outside gets a little bit more bright, so maybe we don't want it that much. And we can also put our mix a little bit higher to kind of counteract that. So maybe threshold at 0.4 and mix at 0.2. You can always click on M to mute a node. So if you think like, what's this node actually doing? You can click on M, and then you can hide or mute and unmute a node. So maybe this is a bit too much. Let's do something like this. Yes, this already looks way better. So I put it at 0 and threshold at 0.5. Medium is fine. You can put it to high as well. That's totally up to you. But you can see with M that you can showcase your nodes. Now, we have an RGB curves. We have a glare, but I would also like to change the color. I'm going to use a mix node here. Just pop it in here. And now I think it's white. But if we put this to multiply and put this image to another color, we can see that now everything is just this color. Awesome, right? So if you're happy with these results, I highly suggest you are gonna start rendering. But before you render, you need to keep in mind that whatever's in the viewer is not necessarily going to be saved as a render, right? So if you're happy with your result, I highly suggest you put the last node inside the composite, and then you can start rendering. So we want to start rendering with files, right? With separate image files. Go into the output properties and look for a nice output folder. You can just click on here and choose a folder. If you accept this folder, you will see that once you start rendering, so render animation, every single image file will end up inside here. You can see from 1, in my case, all the way to 120. So just render animation, everything will go into the output folder, and then we can start to look at Premiere Pro or any other program in which you can edit your videos. So here we are inside Adobe Premiere Pro. I personally like to use this editing little tab, and then I like to import my video or my whole image sequence. So go to File, Import, and here we can select our first image of the whole sequence, make sure this image sequence is ticked on, and then do Open. So now it loads all those files and creates a video sequence out of it. You can see it even in this little preview here. Now, you can drag this to the timeline, and here we have a timeline. So if you play this, you can see that our animation is now inside Premiere Pro. Awesome. So this is our looping animation. If you put this into TikTok or Instagram, it will just keep looping and looping. And you can check if it loops quite well if you just duplicate it and see if there's any stutter or anything happening in between these two image sequences. And you can see that it's very, very smooth. So what we're essentially going to do now is we're going to create another loop inside of our loop. And it seems weird, but let's duplicate these two again. So I'm actually going into my last one here. Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V. And here you can see that I duplicated it 4 times. It's just Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V, by the way. What happens if a person looks at this? It's just quite boring, as I said before. It's the whole time the same color, and maybe around a few rotations, you're like kind of like, okay, I have seen what is happening. It is not that interesting anymore. Especially in a simpler scene, right? There's not a lot to look at. It's just one singular little thing rotating over and over again. But if we're now just gonna change colors, we can essentially keep a little bit of interest in here. So what I'm gonna do is go into effects, and then we are gonna look for video effects, and here, color correction. So if you select your first image sequence, we can put our color balance HLS in here. There are probably other ways to do this, but this is just the way that I found. Go into your first frame. So up here I have effects controls, and here you can see the timeline again, but only for this sequence. In here you can see all of the animation options that you can do, or essentially we have the position here, but you could animate the position as well. We are going to animate this hue. So make sure you toggle animation on the first frame, and we already created a little keyframe here. So these are being shown as little diamonds in this program. So let me create a new one. And here you can see what this animation or where this keyframe is. You can delete them with just the delete button if you want to, but the first one is going to be a hue of 0, and then in the first frame. So what does this hue do? Essentially what it does is it changes the hue around the color wheel. And of course we don't see a color wheel here, but you can see that this is shown as degrees. And in a wheel or in a circle are 360 degrees, and you will see that it reaches every color, and then the wheel starts again, right? So we did a whole rotation around the circle, and then go over and over and over. So that is essentially what this hue does. So in the first frame of our first sequence, we want the hue to be 0. Make sure we have a little diamond there, or a keyframe, and then we can go to the last frame. Now we can choose how far we want this to go. So I'm gonna choose 60. In Premiere Pro, it automatically now starts to put down a keyframe because we put this toggle animation on. You can also put keyframes here, but I'm not going too deep into that. So what happens now, from 0, it goes to 60, and that is this purplish color. Now in a second sequence, we want to start, or first add of course our color correction color balance HLS. Start at 60. Make sure our toggle animation is on. Go to the last frame, and now let's do 120. From now it goes into purple, nice and smooth, and then goes towards pink. So there are two ways to animate this loopable. We can go the whole 360 degrees, or we can go towards a color, in this case 120, and then go in the next sequences back to the original blue color again. Right? So the whole 360 degrees will also end up at the blue color, or you can go forward and go backwards again. Let's do the latter. We're going to go backwards again in these two sequences. So the first frame of this third sequence also has a color balance. U starts at 120. Then the last frame goes back to 60 again. 60. Then from this sequence, again, color balance. The first frame will be 60. And the last frame will be 0. So now if you play this, you can see we go from light blue to purple, from purple towards pink, then from pinkish, we go back to the purple again, and now we go slowly towards the first color, which is light blue, and now this animation has essentially two loops. The first smaller loops are these rotations, and now we have a bigger loop, which essentially is all of this color change. So now it looks way more interesting because we have some different colors in here. I would highly appreciate it if you could maybe comment down below, like and subscribe, because for sure more videos of this kind will end up in your timeline. I hope you guys learned from this, and I'll see you guys in the next video.